On the morning my daughter decided my house was already hers, she brought a locksmith with her. I want to tell you about the day she stood in my kitchen and said, "Dad, it's time you understood how this works now," and how she had absolutely no idea what was sitting in my fireproof box in the study closet. My name doesn't matter yet. What matters is that for 31 years I paid the mortgage on this house one paycheck at a time, and I was not about to hand the deed to anyone who thought a moving truck was the same thing as a conversation. Some parts of what follows have been shaped for the telling, but the lesson in it is as real as anything I've lived. Before I go further, tell me where you're watching from tonight. I like knowing who's sitting with me for this. It was a Thursday in early October, the kind of morning where the frost hadn't quite decided whether to show up on the grass. I was at the kitchen table with my coffee and the crossword, and Eleanor, my wife, 49 years married, that June was at the stove doing what she always did with her oatmeal, standing there stirring it like it needed convincing. Eleanor had been 6 weeks out from a hip replacement, moving slower than she used to, leaning on the counter more than she'd admit to. We'd settled into a rhythm since the surgery. Quiet mornings, coffee, the particular piece of two people who'd been through enough together that silence didn't need filling. I heard the car in the driveway before I heard the knock, and I remember thinking it was early for a visit. Our daughter Renee didn't usually come by before 9, not with her job at the insurance office starting at 8:30. But there she was, letting herself in through the side door the way she'd done since she was 16, except this time, she wasn't alone. Behind her came her husband Craig, and behind him, a man I didn't recognize, carrying a black canvas bag with tools poking out the top. "Morning, Dad," Renee said, and there was something in her voice, a briskness, that made the coffee in my stomach turn over before my brain caught up to why. "Renee." I set down my pen. "What's going on?" She didn't sit. That was the first thing I noticed, usually. She'd pull out a chair, ask about my knee, steal a piece of toast off Eleanor's plate. This morning she stood at the head of the table like she'd rehearsed standing there. Craig hung back near the door with his arms crossed, and the man with the tool bag lingered in the entryway like he wasn't sure whether he was welcome, which, as it turned out, was the one instinct in that room that was correctly calibrated. "Dad, we need to talk about the house," Renee said. "You and Mom can't keep managing 4 bedrooms and 2 floors on your own. Not with her hip, not with your blood pressure. It's not safe anymore." "We've been managing fine," I said. "You fell asleep in the recliner with the stove burner on last month," she said. "Mom told me." I looked at Eleanor. Eleanor's spoon had gone still in the pot. "That burner had a pot of water on it for tea," I said slowly. I dozed off for 10 minutes. "That is not the same thing as—" "It's exactly the same thing, Dad. That's how it starts." Renee's voice climbed a register, the tone she used to use as a teenager when she'd already decided she was right and just needed the rest of us to catch up. "Craig and I talked to a contractor. We're going to convert the basement into an in-law suite for you and Mom. 1 level, no stairs, everything you need close by. And we've already started looking at the paperwork to get the house transferred into a family trust, so it's protected, no probate, no fighting over it later. Gary here." She gestured at the man with the tool bag, and my stomach dropped clean through the floor. "Is just here to check the current locks and give us a quote on a new smart system for when you move in with us." "Move in with you," I repeated. "It makes sense, Dad. You'll have people around. Mom won't be alone if something happens. And Craig's mother is going to need somewhere too, eventually, so it's a good long-term plan for everybody." There it was. Craig's mother. Not urgency about us at all. A future tenant already being penciled into a life Eleanor and I hadn't agreed to give up. "Renee," I said, and I kept my voice level even though something in my chest had gone tight and cold. Nobody discussed a trust with me. Nobody discussed a basement conversion, and nobody discussed moving out of this house. "We're discussing it now," she said. Like that settled it. Eleanor turned off the burner. She came and stood beside my chair, one hand finding my shoulder, and when she spoke, her voice had the particular steadiness she gets when she's furious and refuses to let it show as anything but calm. "This is our home, Renee. Nobody transfers anything without our say." Something moved across Renee's face, quick, there and gone. The look of someone whose plan had just hit a wall they hadn't accounted for. "Mom, I'm not trying to take anything from you. I'm trying to protect it. Do you know what happens to a house like this if one of you ends up in a nursing home? Medicaid takes it. Everything you've worked for, gone to pay for a bed in a facility. If it's in a trust, that can't happen. I looked this up," I'm trying to save this house, not steal it. It was a good argument. I want you to notice that, because it's important later. It sounded reasonable. It sounded like the kind of thing a caring daughter says. And for about 4 seconds, standing in my own kitchen, I almost believed her. Then I looked at Gary by the door, standing there with a bag full of tools for locks that weren't his to change. And I looked at Craig, who still hadn't said a single word, arms crossed, eyes on the floor like a man waiting out a storm he'd helped cause. And I thought, if this were really about protecting us, why did it arrive with a locksmith instead of a phone call? Gary, I said, I appreciate you coming out, but there's been a misunderstanding. Nobody's changing any locks today. Gary looked at Renee. Renee looked at me with an expression I'd never seen on her before, not disappointment, not concern. Something colder. Something closer to calculation, recalibrating in real time. Fine, she said. We'll talk about it later, when you've had time to think it through logically instead of getting emotional. She grabbed her purse off the counter. Gary, I'm sorry. I'll call you. Craig, let's go. They left the way they'd come, through the side door, and Gary trailed after them, looking relieved to be leaving. The house went quiet except for the tick of the stove cooling and Eleanor's hand still resting on my shoulder, gripping harder now than her hip surgery should have allowed. Walter, she said, that folder in her bag, did you see it? I hadn't. I'd been too busy watching The Locksmith, but now that she mentioned it, I remembered a manila folder tucked under Renee's arm the whole time, never opened, never mentioned. The kind of thing you bring when you expect to need it and hope you won't. I sat there a long moment after they'd gone, the crossword forgotten, the coffee gone cold, and I thought about the day Eleanor and I signed the papers on this house, back in 1994. I was 34 years old, working second shift at the Kessler tool plant, and Eleanor was pregnant with Renee. We'd walked through empty rooms with a realtor who kept apologizing for the outdated kitchen, and Eleanor had stood in the middle of that ugly 70s linoleum and said, I can already see us here. I cried in the truck afterward, alone, because I'd just signed my name to 30 years of payments and I had no idea, none, how we were going to make the first one, let alone the 360 that came after. We made every one. Some years easier than others. In 2003, when the plant went through layoffs and I held on to my job by working double shifts nobody else wanted, we came within 6 weeks of losing the house. Eleanor took a part-time job at the elementary school cafeteria, 6 a.m. shifts, to cover the gap. Renee was 11 then. She never knew how close it came. She grew up in these walls thinking the ground under her was solid, because Eleanor and I had made absolutely sure it felt that way, even when it wasn't. I got up, walked to the study, and stood in the doorway looking at the closet where the fireproof box had sat, untouched, for going on 9 years. I didn't open it yet. I just needed to know it was there. That evening, after Eleanor had gone to bed early, worn out from the morning, I sat in the living room with the lamp on and thought about the folder under Renee's arm. Nobody carries an unopened folder to a conversation like that unless there's something in it they're saving for later, something they didn't get the chance to use because I hadn't given them the opening. I decided I needed to know what was in it before they decided to try again. The next morning, I drove to see my neighbor, Walt Higgins, coincidence on the name. We'd laughed about it for 15 years. 2 Walters on the same cul-de-sac. Walt was 71, a retired postal carrier, and he had one of those doorbell cameras that also covered a good stretch of the shared driveway between our houses, since our lots backed up close together. Walt, I said, standing on his porch with my hands in my coat pockets, I need to ask you something a little strange. Strange is my specialty these days, he said, and waved me in. I told him some of it, not everything, just enough, that I had reason to think Renee and Craig had been by the house recently when Eleanor and I weren't home, and I wanted to know if his camera had caught anything. Walt didn't ask why. He pulled up the app on his phone, scrolled back through the last month, and there it was, a Tuesday, 2 weeks back, timestamp, 10:14 in the morning. The exact hour Eleanor had a physical therapy appointment, and I'd driven her there myself. Craig's truck, pulling into our driveway. Craig getting out, walking to our front door, and my chest went tight watching it producing a key. Not knocking. A key, straight into the lock, like he'd done it before. You didn't give him a key, Walt said. It wasn't a question. No, I said. I didn't. We watched the timestamp jump forward. 40 minutes later, Craig came back out carrying a cardboard box, set it in his truck bed, and drove off. A box. From my house. I had no idea what was in it, and the not knowing sat like a stone behind my sternum the whole drive home. I went straight to the study when I got back, before I'd even taken my coat off, and I did an inventory of the room the way I used to inventory my tool shed after a break-in scare years back, corner to corner, methodical, looking for what didn't belong and what was missing. It took me almost 20 minutes to notice. The fireproof box was still there, still locked, but it had been moved. Not far, maybe 3 inches to the left, angled slightly differently than I always left it. Someone had picked it up, maybe tried the lock, and set it back down not quite where they found it. They hadn't gotten into it, but they'd tried. I called Eleanor into the study and showed her. Her face went pale in a way that had nothing to do with her hip. "Walter," she said, "what's in that box that they'd want badly enough to come into our house for?" I hadn't told her the full truth in 9 years, not because I didn't trust her, but because we'd agreed, both of us, sitting in an attorney's office one gray February afternoon, that some decisions are easier to make quietly and explain later, when later actually arrived. I think, standing in that study with my wife's hand gripping my arm, later had arrived. "It's time I called Marion," I said. Marion Castellano had been our attorney since Renee was in middle school. She'd drawn up our wills, handled the refinance in 2009, and 9 years ago, in that February meeting, she'd helped us do something Renee had never been told about. Marion picked up on the second ring, the way she always did, like she kept the line half open for people like me. I told her everything, the folder, the locksmith, the key Craig shouldn't have had. The box moved 3 inches in my study. "Walter," she said, and her voice had gone careful in the way it does when she's already 3 steps ahead of me. "I need you to come in tomorrow morning. And bring the box, if you're comfortable moving it. There's something else, too. Something that came across my desk about 8 months ago that I didn't call you about at the time, because at the time it looked like nothing. I'm starting to think it wasn't nothing." My stomach dropped the way it does on the first hill of a roller coaster, the part where you already regret getting on. "What kind of something?" "Tomorrow," she said. "In person. Bring Eleanor if she's up for the drive." I didn't sleep much that night. I lay there listening to Eleanor's breathing even out beside me, and I thought about Renee at 7 years old, riding her bike up and down this driveway until the streetlights came on, and I thought about the folder under her arm, and I could not make those two images sit together in the same person without something in my chest twisting. Marion's office smelled the way it always had: old carpet and coffee strong enough to stand a spoon in. She had 2 folders waiting on her desk when Eleanor and I sat down, one blue, one a manila color. I didn't like the look of it all. "Let's start with the blue one," Marion said. "Your trust. The one we set up in 2015. She walked us through it again, the way she had 9 years ago, how the house had been placed into a revocable trust with Eleanor and I as sole trustees, meaning we controlled it completely for as long as we were both living. Full authority to sell, refinance, or do absolutely nothing at all. Nothing changed day to day, but the part that mattered now was the successor clause, the part about what happened after. "When you two came to me in 2015, Marion said, you told me you wanted the house to go to your grandchildren's education fund when the time came, administered independently, specifically because you were worried Renee wasn't yet, and I'm using your words from 9 years ago, Walter, not mine, ready to be trusted with something that size. You asked me never to disclose that to her unless it became necessary." Eleanor's hand found mine under the desk. "Renee doesn't know," Marion continued. "She has spent years, I'd guess, assuming this house was simply going to come to her eventually, the way these things usually do, and she's built decisions around that assumption. Which brings me to the manila folder." She opened it. Inside was a printout, a home equity line of credit application, dated 8 months back, listing our address, our names, a request against the equity in the house for $94,000. "You didn't file this," Marion said. "It wasn't a question either. I've never seen this in my life," I said. And my voice came out strange, hollowed out. "The bank's fraud department flagged it," Marion said. "The signature didn't match your file from the original mortgage. A loan officer named Priscilla Wembley called this office because I'm listed as attorney of record on the title. She asked whether I wanted to pursue it. At the time, I told her to hold everything and let me investigate quietly, because I didn't yet know whether this was fraud or simply an administrative error, and I didn't want to alarm you over nothing. I should have called you the moment I found out it wasn't nothing. I'm sorry, Walter. That's on me." I picked up the application and looked at the signature line, my name. written by someone who had studied my handwriting closely enough to get most of it right and not quite closely enough to fool a professional. The W had the wrong slant. I'd made that same W 10,000 times on paychecks and permission slips and Christmas cards, and this wasn't it. Forging a signature on a HELOC application is bank fraud, Marion said quietly. Federal, if it crosses state lines through the loan processor, which this one did. I am not telling you what to do with that. I'm telling you so you understand the shape of what we're dealing with. I set the paper down slowly and pressed both hands flat against my knees, the way I used to steady myself in the plant when a machine jammed, and you had 30 seconds to think clearly before it mattered. Marion, I said, tell me why. What would Renee need $94,000 for? Marion slid a third document across the desk, a civil court filing, public record. Craig's name at the top. A judgment against him, $41,000. Related to a failed investment in a used car resale operation he'd put money into 2 years back with a business partner who'd since disappeared with what remained of the capital. Beneath that, a second filing a separate judgment, this one smaller, $18,000, from a personal loan gone into default, and a third the mortgage on Craig and Renee's own home, 6 weeks delinquent. $94,000, Marion said, clears every one of those with room to spare. And I'd bet money the basement conversion they mentioned was never going to be a basement conversion at all. My professional read, Walter, and I want to be careful here because I could be wrong, is that they intended to get the equity line approved, use the proceeds to solve their own financial crisis, and manage the repayment quietly, using rental income from the finished basement once you and Eleanor were living in a smaller space they controlled. It only works if you're out of the house and they have functional control of it. That's what the trust conversation was really circling. The room went very quiet. Eleanor's grip on my hand had gone tight enough to ache. What do we do? She said. Not a question. A demand, in the voice she'd used on Renee's third-grade teacher over a grading dispute 20-some years back. A voice I hadn't heard in a long time and was glad, in that moment, to hear again. First, Marion said, you don't confront them yet. Not until the locks are changed and the paperwork is airtight, because timing matters enormously here. Second, I want a letter from your physician confirming you're both of sound mind, simply to close off any avenue where someone tries to claim otherwise later. Third, and I know this one is hard, I want you to let them think they still have a chance to talk you into it. It buys us the runway we need. I drove home with the manila folder on the passenger seat and a feeling in my chest I hadn't expected. Not rage exactly, though there was plenty of that underneath. Something colder and steadier on top of it. The feeling of a man who has finally been handed the whole picture and can now, at last, act on it instead of guessing. Renee called that Sunday, her voice warm again, apologetic even, the way it got when she wanted something back on track. Dad, I feel bad about how Thursday went. Can Craig and I come by tonight? I want to show you the basement plans properly this time. I think you'll like them. I said yes. Not because I'd softened, because there are things you can only learn about a person when they believe they're still winning. They arrived at 6 with a folder, a different one this time, glossy, printed full of basement renderings, paint swatches, a walk-in shower Renee had circled twice. She talked for 20 minutes about grab bars and wheelchair clearance and how much closer we'd all be. Craig sat beside her, nodding at the right intervals, the posture of a man rehearsing agreement. I let her finish. Renee, I said, before we talk about any of this, I need to ask you something, and I want the truth. Does Craig have a key to this house? The room went still. I watched the practiced warmth drain out of her face in real time, replaced by something faster, something calculating. Mom gave it to him, she said, ages ago, in case of emergency. I looked at Eleanor. Eleanor shook her head, slow and deliberate. I never gave anyone a key, Renee. Don't put that on your mother. He came into this house 3 weeks ago, I said, while your mother and I were at her therapy appointment, and he took a box out of it. My study was disturbed, and 8 months ago, someone filed a home equity line of credit application against this house for $94,000, with a signature that was not mine, on a form that would have gone straight to paying off the judgment against Craig's failed car business and the arrears on your own mortgage. Craig's face went the color of drywall. Renee's mouth opened, closed, opened again. You don't know what you're talking about, she said, but her voice had lost its footing. I have security footage of Craig using a key he shouldn't have had, I said. I have a forged loan application with a fraud flag from the bank. I have 3 separate judgment filings against your husband that are a matter of public record, and I have an attorney who has been assembling all of it since Tuesday. So before you tell me I don't know what I'm talking about, I'd ask you to consider very carefully whether you want to keep going in that direction." Craig stood up so fast his chair scraped the floor. "This is insane. Nobody forged anything. You're confused. You're 70 years old. You don't remember signing things." "I remember exactly what I signed and what I didn't," I said, and my voice came out low and even, the voice I used to use on the plant floor when a young hire was about to do something that would get somebody hurt. "Sit down, Craig." "Lead." He didn't sit down. He walked out, slammed the side door hard enough to rattle the window over the sink, and I heard his truck peel out of the driveway a few seconds later. Renee stood frozen in the middle of my living room, the glossy folder still in her hands, looking suddenly much younger than 38, looking, for just a moment, like the girl who used to cry when she thought she'd disappointed us. "Dad," she said, and her voice cracked down the middle. "It wasn't supposed to go like this." "Sit down," I said, gentler now. "Tell me the truth. All of it. And I mean all of it, Renee, because I already know most of it, and I'd rather hear the rest from you than from a court filing." She sat, and slowly, in pieces, it came out. Craig's investment had collapsed 18 months back. They'd been drowning ever since, hiding it from everyone, including, at first, from each other. The HELOC had been Craig's idea, something he'd found online, a family equity solution. Some finance forum had suggested, and he'd talked Renee into believing it was really just borrowing against an inheritance she'd get eventually anyway. No harm, no foul, paperwork now instead of paperwork later. She swore, looking me dead in the eye, that she hadn't known about the forged signature that Craig had told her. The bank required a formality signature, and she hadn't looked closely at what she was watching him sign. I believed the first part. I was less certain about the second, and I told her so. "I need you to understand something," I said. "This house was never going to be yours automatically, Renee. Your mother and I put it in a trust 9 years ago, and the terms don't name you as the heir. They never did." Her face did something complicated, grief and shock, and, underneath it, something that looked almost like relief, like a weight coming off a shelf. She hadn't realized she'd been straining to hold up. "Why didn't you tell me?" she whispered. "Because at the time," I said, "we weren't sure you were ready to hear it without resenting us for it. I'm starting to think we were right to wait, and wrong about why." Eleanor moved to sit beside our daughter and put an arm around her, and for a long moment nobody said anything at all. I sat across from them and watched my wife hold our girl the way she used to when Renee was small and scraped a knee, and I thought about how much of parenting never actually ends, it just changes shape. The following 2 weeks were the busiest I'd had since retirement. I had every lock in the house change new deadbolts, a video doorbell with a two-way speaker, the kind Marion recommended specifically because it let me see and speak to whoever came to the door without opening it. I hired a part-time home health aide named Corinne for Eleanor, 3 mornings a week, someone steady and kind who had Eleanor doing hip exercises on the porch within a week of meeting her. I drove Eleanor to see Dr. Alvarez, who wrote the competency letter Marion had asked for without a single question, because good doctors know when not to ask. And Marion assembled everything, the footage, the forged application, the judgment filings, the doctor's letter, the trust summary into a single folder that sat on my entryway table like a loaded weapon I hoped I wouldn't need to fire. Craig didn't come around again. Renee did, twice, quiet visits, no folders, just sitting at the kitchen table drinking coffee with her mother, while I watched from the doorway with something in my chest I couldn't quite name. Not forgiveness yet, not quite. Coming in forment, but the beginning of a road toward it. The confrontation I'd been bracing for never came the way I expected. Instead, 3 weeks after that Sunday, Marion called to tell me the bank's fraud investigation had concluded the HELOC application was formally denied and flagged, and because the amount and interstate processing crossed a federal threshold, the file had been referred, as a matter of bank policy, to the appropriate authorities for review. Whether charges followed was out of my hands, and frankly, out of my interest at that point. I had gotten what I needed. The house was safe, the fraud was documented, and Craig's name was on paperwork now that had nothing to do with me at all. Craig moved out of Renee's house in November. I heard through Eleanor, who heard it through Renee, sitting at that same kitchen table, crying quietly into a mug of coffee going cold. The marriage didn't survive what came after, not the fraud charge specifically, but everything underneath it. Years of decisions made in the dark that Renee said she was only now, for the first time, seeing the full shape of. By December, the trees on our street had gone bare, and the mornings had that flat gray Ohio quality that doesn't flatter anything, but doesn't lie about anything either. Eleanor was walking without her cane most days. Corinne still came 3 mornings a week, though we both suspected it was as much for the company now as the therapy. Renee came every Sunday, alone, and we'd started slowly rebuilding something that wasn't what we'd had before, but wasn't nothing either. One evening, in late December, Eleanor and I sat at the kitchen table after dinner, the way we had for 30 years, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea. "Walter," she said, "do you regret keeping the trust a secret from her all those years?" I thought about it honestly before I answered, because she deserved an honest answer. "No," I said. "I regret that it took a locksmith standing in my kitchen to find out I was right to." She smiled at that, small and tired and real. "I want to tell you something before I let you go tonight. Something I wish someone had told me 40 years ago at that kitchen table with an empty checkbook and a new mortgage, and no idea how any of it would turn out. Love your children with everything you've got, but love is not the same thing as handing someone the keys to your whole life just because they asked nicely, or because saying no felt harder than saying yes. A parent's generosity is not an inheritance someone else gets to schedule. The deed to your own life has your name on it, and it is not selfish to keep it that way until you decide, freely, to let it go. If tonight's story sat with you, tell me in the comments. I read every one of them, and I mean that. And if you know somebody quietly carrying the same weight I carried in that kitchen, share this with them. Sometimes the only thing a person needs is to hear that somebody else made it through the other side of exactly this. Thank you for staying with me tonight. I'll see you next time.